right, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the GIMI Think Tank 2022. The think tank started during COVID and has been continuing over the last many years, talking about topics on innovation. Three specific types of topics that we focus on. First, trends that are going to change the world and as a result create a different future. And therefore we can come imagine what the new world is going to be. So we bring people who speak trends. We also have speakers who come and talk about innovation management. Basically, as we have seen Industry 4.0, think 4.0 versions coming out, innovation is now facing the same thing. Innovation management is facing innovation management 4.0. What's next in innovation? And then we also talk about innovation in different countries. And we learn from the different countries. Three different areas for learning. That's what the GIMI Think Tank covers. And today we have a great speaker. Next slide, please. Who's a colleague of the GIMI community. He has been one of the first partners of GIMI. His name is Dr. Mohab, and he has been basically a leader of innovation in the Middle East, basically driving science-based technology with nanotechnology and other thought process of those things, but also with innovation management, helping big companies, helping small companies, helping universities. This gentleman has done virtually everything. He's training out of Canada, and he and I have worked together for many years, and he's a published author, a thought leader, and we're going to learn about assets, intangible assets called IP, intellectual property. And this is an interesting conversation for all of you to think about, because many people think that in order to do innovation, you need money. Money is one of them. But there are also a whole bunch of other assets that you can leverage to be able to go faster and quicker. Today, we're going to have a great presentation from Dr. Mohab, and looking forward to his great talks. Mohab, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, HP. Good evening, everyone. Good morning, everyone. Just a quick introduction. So as HP mentioned, that I actually wear two hats. One hat is that I'm the CEO at Innovety, and Innovety, it's an innovation management consultancy. We've been doing business over the past 13 years now, and we've been working in different countries in the Middle East, primarily in Egypt, but also we've done many projects in Lebanon, Jordan, and some of the areas of the Gulf GCC. And my second hat is
if I can just make a plug on that, Mohab, just so you guys know, I mean, I don't think there's anybody in that region who knows about innovation more than these guys. They've worked with the World Bank and IDB or time equivalents. They've worked with governments, they've worked with universities, they've worked with corporations, and they work with small companies also. And not just market-based innovation, but science-based, pricing-based, business model-based, it doesn't matter. Every aspect of business innovation has been covered by these guys. Very broad, very deep.
You're raising the bar, HP, but I'll try to meet this kind of expectation. The other thing I should mention to you is that we have recently been collaborating very well with SIA partners from the UAE. We've been co-applying for projects and co-executing projects. So it just, again, symbolizes the importance of these kind of GIMI meetings. It just allows us to know more about each other and to do things together. So I wanted to maybe share my screen and tell you a little bit about what I'm going to be talking to you today. Let me just put it full screen. So let me just give you the bottom line first. The bottom line is that I'm sure that you're all familiar with the GIMI process and the GIMI methodology as how to develop different type of business opportunities for different organizations, whether they are corporates, whether they are non-for-profit, small and medium enterprises, and so forth. And what I want to talk to you today is a methodology that we have put together that complements what GIMI has put in place as the methodology for innovation, something that you might find interesting, that's something that you can apply for yourself in your respective countries. And I'll be more than happy to share with you again more of our experience in this regard. The idea here is that when any organization wants to innovate, they have the option of either looking into trends and opportunities that they might not have looked at before, different technological trends, non-technological trends, behavioral trends. But here we try to basically tell organizations that one of the starting points that you can have is to look inside first, effectively open up your stomach, see all the different type of things that you own as intellectual assets, and try to couple this with different business models to be able to monetize, to effectively achieve financial sustainability. This becomes quite important when you're talking about organizations that are non-for-profit. So things like universities, NGOs, INGOs, who typically rely on grants and fundraising to generate revenue to cover their operational costs. Whereas if they actually think in a different way with a different business mindset and to look inside as to what they actually own and what they have, they can actually find numerous ways to generate revenue. And that's what I want to be talking to you about today, is how can you look internally into your intellectual assets and to see how you can derive business models from there. So I want to talk about three very specific things today. One of them is the assessment and analyzing of intellectual assets. What are these intellectual assets and how do you analyze them? And I want to talk to you about, once you analyze them, what would you do after that? You can do one of two things: either a legal component related to these intellectual assets, or you can apply what GIMI has always provided, which is the business opportunity mapping that is coupled with these intellectual assets. So there's a legal and there's a business output that you can get after you analyze these kind of intellectual assets. So I want to actually start with this slide that I'm sure that you're all familiar with, which is the innovation pipeline that GIMI highlights as the basis of how to develop new opportunities, where you start off with, the setup phase, where you understand the status quo of an organization very well, where is the pressure coming from, where are the hotspots, and then from there come up with different types of ideas that are based on looking around outside your boundaries, looking at different trends, as I mentioned, connecting these different dots, establishing what we call fields of play, and then ultimately coming up with business opportunities and picking which ones really need to be prioritized and effectively you can pursue them later on. So what we did is that we took that as our basis, and we coupled this with a methodology that I'll be talking about to you today. Is that during this setup phase in particular, this is an opportunity for organizations to look inside themselves and to see what kind of intellectual assets that they own. And from there, you start taking these intellectual assets to the diverge phase, where we start looking at different opportunities that might exist in the market, connecting these opportunities, defining after that business opportunities that you would prioritize. So I guess the main change that we've done here are in the first two steps, which is the setup and the diverge. And that's what I really want to talk to you about today. So the process that we follow is that we do what we call an intellectual asset analysis of the organization. And then from there, we define different business opportunities that are based on these intellectual assets, prioritize them, and then we basically hopefully define the ones that would make most sense and enter the market with them. So the first step that we do is that we do this kind of intellectual asset analysis and an assessment of what are the existing products and services of the company. And this you can use the business opportunity map that is provided by GIMI, of course. Here we're using it for a different perspective. Here we're using it for just analyzing the status quo. So we're trying to understand from the offering point of view, what are the products and services that the company presently has? What are the intellectual assets? Who are the segments that they are serving? What are the best business models that the organization is presently applying with all the different variations? What are the key technologies that this organization is trying to leverage on? And ultimately, what are kind of channels are they using to build either awareness, learning, or allowing customers or beneficiaries to purchase and deliver their products. So we effectively do kind of like a very, very quick status quo analysis of what the company presently has from a business point of view. And then we couple this with what we call the intellectual assets, okay? And here I want to tell you that there's a difference between intellectual assets and intellectual property. Intellectual property are things that you can actually protect, whereas intellectual assets are kind of the more broader thinking, where some of these assets you can protect, other ones you cannot. But you can make use of all of them. So intellectual assets very broadly can be categorized in those three types, either what we call structured capital, relational capital, or human capital. So in the structural capital, we typically look at things like the kind of content, the kind of processes that an organization might have, the kind of databases, the kind of technologies, the kind of inventions, any kind of software that the company effectively is using. Relational capital really talks about what kind of assets does the company have in relationship with the outside world. So for example, databases of partners, databases of clients, the different channels that they can exploit through social media and so forth. Whereas at the end, the human capital is effectively what are the know-how, what's the primary kind of know-how and competencies that the people inside the organization actually have. Those three combined, they constitute what we call the intellectual assets of the organization. Very, very important assets. And the idea is how can you take them to the next step, which is to monetize and come up with business opportunities. So just for you to, just to give some examples. So as I mentioned, structural capital examples could be things like training material, processes, things like videos, any kind of knowledge-based materials. So for GIMI, for example, has many of those type of material and structural capitals. It also includes processes. So the process of how you deliver, the process of how you do monitoring and evaluation to certain offerings. It also includes any kind of software. So we know, for example, that GIMI has many types of software, either for the purpose of assessing capabilities, whether it is for assessing organizations based for different purposes. And finally, another example would be if you actually have a hardware product or hardware technology that you might own. So these are examples of structural capitals. These are other examples of relational capitals, like different type of relationships. These are very important, by the way, relationships that an organization might have with donors, beneficiaries, partners. CRM systems are type of relational capital and different type of channels. All of these are valuable assets to any kind of organization. And finally, we have the human capital, as I mentioned to you, which is the kind of know-how and team expertise that you would find inside the organization. So what we basically do is that we have numerous type of discussions with and the organization, the people inside the organization, and we basically assess all these different types of intellectual assets. All these intellectual assets get assessed. And what we do is that we do this through a set of different type of questionnaires where we ask about, is this something that you have? Is this something that you don't have? Is this something that you own? Is this something that you've licensed? Is this something that you have actually protected in terms of copyright, trademarks? Do you actually have a process for doing the evaluation, or are you just delivering content or material in certain ways? The kind of, what kind of consultation type of, for example, assets do you have? Things related to processes, things related to software. We ask them about all different types of what kind of softwares do you use, which ones do you own, which ones do you license in. So we ask them about that. I'm going a bit fast, but again, I'll be happy to share this with you. We've asked them what kind of databases do you have internally, whether they are internal databases, external databases for partners, beneficiaries, and so forth. Who are your partners? What kind of agreements do you have with your partners? Are they exclusive agreements? Are they non-exclusive agreements? And then we go through what kind of core know-how does the company really, or the organization can really differentiate itself from others. So we have a set of questions where we use these questions to have a full understanding of all the different type of intellectual assets that this organization has. And then what we do is that we create what we call an intellectual asset table. And here we take each one of these different assets and we write next to it whether this asset actually exists or not. Is it documented or not? Is it owned by the organization or not? We actually look into the kind of legal agreements that exist for every asset and to see if the legal agreements actually abide by or confirm the kind of ownership that this organization would have on this asset. And even if they own this asset, do they have any kind of protection? So you know that there are certain protections that you can do, obviously, to patents, copyright, trademarks, as example. We want to assess all of these assets. And we keep doing this for all the other different classes and categories of assets. Things like processes. Things like processes are very, very important to actually be documented, especially when you're talking about exploiting some kind of a franchise model, because the franchisee would not only use the kind of service or products that you're giving him, but also the process of how to use these assets. So documenting things like processes, we assess that very, very well. And we continue to look into all the other different assets. Okay, so we do eventually come up with a really big what we call an intellectual asset table. And then we go to the next step, which is something called the ownership and control graph. So for each one of these assets, we plot it somehow on this map. So this map has two axes. One axis is the control axis. The second axis is the ownership axis. So we try to, based on the understanding that we have and looking and reviewing the different documents inside the organization, we try to plot where these assets exist. Ownership means that this is something that the organization owns or has developed, and control means have they protected it or not. So here, when you look at this is just an example. So here, the highest level of control and ownership exists in the top right quarter. And this is usually where organizations like to be. This is where their assets would like to be. Things that they own and things that is actually protected. But unfortunately, when we did all these assessments for different organizations, this is not always the case. You will find some of them where they are owned, but they are not protected. So you would find them more on the bottom side of this plane, or you would find them that they have very little ownership to it. For example, they have a license agreement, or maybe they didn't even have proper legal documents in place to confirm that they actually own these intellectual assets. So the idea here is that once you do this graph, it's a really nice snapshot of what the organization has and what do they have ownership to and what do they have control over. And our first objective is to try to move these assets from where they are to a point where they are high control and high ownership. So we go actually into these documents, these legal documents, and we have a team that look into some of these intellectual assets. And what we try to do, as I mentioned to you, that we do the first step, which is the legal part, looking into things like have the intellectual assets, do they have the correct protection and protect the right rights? So here, as an example, we seek to protect the assets owned by the organization using different legal tools. So, for example, if you have a trademark that is not protected properly, you have to do that. If you have, for example, a certain type of copyrighted material that you need to protect, you need to make sure that you do something like that. If you have a technology that you might not be familiar with, or you don't know that there's actually value out of it, we provide advice that you can actually protect it through different type of patents. And then we look into something called, for example, transfer ownership of assets that are not yet owned by the organization. So if you find that there's an asset that, for example, the organization licensed it from another player, we make sure that the kind of legal forms are put in place so that you are actually capable of doing the right protection and the right licensing. We look at things like exclusive license types of licensing. We look at the kind of geographical locations that this license would abide by. We look at the duration of the licenses. So we basically look at all the different types of legal components for the different agreements. And why are we doing this? It's all about that I want to increase the ownership and the controllability of an organization towards its intellectual assets, to effectively move these assets as much as possible to the top right corner that I was explaining to you a few minutes ago. So we look at things related to intellectual assets rights, intellectual asset secrecy, contracts that exist inside the organization. Okay, so here, before you actually define what is the business opportunity, you need to ensure as a starting point that you actually can monetize from these intellectual assets. And you cannot monetize from intellectual assets except before going actually through proper control procedures by applying some of these protection measures. Okay. So what we do after that is that once we have this good understanding of the legal framework of these intellectual assets, we effectively do what we all know how to do, which is now I need to define the business opportunities that can come out of these intellectual assets. And here you can follow your typical business opportunity map, where the offering is well defined now, which is your intellectual asset. It's controlled, it's owned, and now you start leveraging on these different intellectual assets by looking at who are the segments that you're going to be effectively working with, the business model. You couple that with the business model and so forth. Okay, so you here, this is the part where you can use the BUM for coming up with the business opportunities after you do the control part. And so as an example, training material, for example, in an organization, this is just like one example, was before in the bottom right corner, which means that it had little control. By doing some legal advising on certain legal advice, you can actually move this training material to being the high control. And now, once it's actually well controlled, then you can actually monetize and create business models from this asset. We look at when we try to come up with different business opportunities, especially when you talk about non-for-profits or universities, we allow these organizations to look at all the different types of stakeholders that they might be able to be working with. This is very important so that we can come up with an opportunity that makes a lot of sense and it has solid partnerships around. We also look at the different revenue models that you can apply to these different intellectual assets. So at the end, when you combine your very good knowledge of intellectual assets which is now controlled and protected, and you couple that with different revenue models that you can look at and different type of target segments or beneficiaries, you effectively would come up with an opportunity, a business opportunity that can allow an organization to actually grow. So as an example, this is an organization that we were working with called Educate Me. They are effectively an organization that provides different type of educational solutions. We effectively did this intellectual asset to them. We looked at all the different type of assets, the content, the procedures, the methodologies, the tools, the everything. And then we started looking at that they can actually use some of this training material, partner with an organization such as Pearson in the UK, and come up with some really nice type of certifications that can be targeting teachers who want to be certified to be teaching kids. And we created the business model around that, which was based on a subscription model. And we outlined the kind of resources that we would need for this business opportunity to be successful. So the conclusion of all this is that this is a methodology that can actually be very useful for, it can definitely be used for corporates, by the way, for-profit organizations, but this becomes extremely attractive for non-for-profit organizations, universities, foundations that really want to take the next step in terms of growth by assessing what they presently have. This is something that I can also tell you that we've applied with 4 different universities that wanted to see other ways to generate revenue other than just the tuition of the students. So effectively, we did the same thing. We opened up the stomach of the universities. We started looking at all the different assets that they own, and then come up with a roadmap for how they can innovate while using all these different intellectual assets, and using the business opportunity map as the main driving force to come up with the different opportunities. So I hope that you appreciate this methodology, and I'll be more than happy to again shed more light on this. And if you want to contact me at any time, I'll be more than happy to support you in this. And if you want to apply to any other clients. And thank you so much.
Mohab, that was a great double click on a lot of insights of innovation itself. And so maybe we can stop sharing for a second and talk about what was brought up over here. One is there is a process that seems to be pretty ubiquitous. It works nearly everywhere. And so that's we are lucky. We have a simple process that can be applied across industry segments and everything else. And then it allows you to also think in new and different ways. And so the thing I want to double click on is this thing called intangible assets, right? And intangible assets is everywhere. It's everywhere in companies. It's everywhere in organizations. People don't see them. People don't see them as something valuable. Those are dots. Those are part of the dots we talk about, that you can connect together to come up with something bigger, and they can be leveraged, right? So I want to make sure when people say return on assets, these are the assets that we are talking about. Not just the cash assets, not just the buildings that you have, but these other assets that if you sit around the table, you might say, what about this? What about that? What about this? Right? So that's the first degree of understanding, is there are other assets. And I just want to make sure one of our biggest assets for me is the GIMI network. This GIMI network that we have over here, all we got to do is send one email out on WhatsApp and say, we need somebody who knows a lot about Bitcoin, or we need somebody about this. And just like that, we got knowledge entering our system. And that's an asset that you can't put on the balance sheet of your company. But that's what makes us better, faster, quicker. So to be able to inventory those intangible assets are really important. And the companies who actually do it and the individuals who understand it are the ones who actually do more innovation, for sure. So what were the most interesting types of assets that which are intangible, which were surprises to you also, Mohab, as you guys did this research, that you didn't consider them as assets, and you said, wait a second, that's an intangible asset. That's a really valuable asset. Were there some examples that you guys came up with where you said, wow, we had not considered that, but that is truly an intangible asset?
You're absolutely right, HP. So some of these assets, the organizations might actually not be familiar with, and they're not really clear about. For example, one of the things that we had an organization that had an internal database of all the different types of suppliers and potential distributors for a particular sector. And something like this, they were using it in their day-to-day operations, and they did not realize that this is a very important asset that they had, and they can actually allow them to partner with other organizations such as export councils, for example, things like business associations, to use this kind of a database in a way that can allow them to partner in better ways, and even come up with a product that is capitalizing on all these kind of databases that they might have. This is like one example. The other thing is that a lot of the organizations, they especially the non-for-profit ones, they did not really understand really well the concept of licensing a trademark. And the idea here, for example, we found that many organizations, they thought that they have to do everything on their own with what they know. However, when they started thinking about that, hey, I have actually a trademark for myself, I have actually internal processes that normally organizations don't document. because it's just part of their normal operations. But actually, when they actually document this process in a nice way, they can immediately leverage this as a way to franchise their business model. So I had, for example, an organization called Education for Employment. It's a well-known organization around the world that helps fresh graduates to find employment opportunities. And they had very centralized operations in Cairo, and they really wanted to expand otherwise. So we talked about that they can quickly establish a franchise model and service different parts in Upper Egypt, even outside of Egypt. So we were looking into franchising a model in Lebanon and also in Jordan. So there are many assets that companies and organizations take for granted, and they don't really realize that these could be like a core thing that they can leverage on with different business models.
Mohab, one of the things that we do with companies when we're trying to come up with new big ideas is we'll say, bring your suppliers to the workshop for what might be the ideas. And the notion of the reason why we do that is we believe that our suppliers' assets are also your assets if you can figure out how to discuss it properly. And so by putting them in the same room, their factories and their labs and their people are also part of your assets. But if you just look at yourself, it's going to look very small. So we draw circles around and around saying, who else do we know and who else has things to add to this? And this is what you were doing. You were mapping very systematically the circles of software and technology assets, the structural way to get the relational assets. And so if you map it, you'll find something. You're going to find some amazing assets.
Absolutely, HP. This is exactly a wonderful example for the relational type of capital, the relational type of intellectual assets. There are structural assets that you have as an organization inside, but you also have the responsibility to see who are the kind of stakeholders and organizations that you are touching, either from the front end or from the back end, and to see what kind of assets that they have and what kind of relations do you have to capitalize on these assets. You're absolutely correct. And that's why when we talked about intellectual assets, we created a clear distinction between structural capital, which is our assets that are inside the organization, and the relational ones.
Yeah. So for many people who do valuation of companies, when you value a company and you look at the balance sheet and you say, what's the value of the company? The balance sheet minus the debt is never the value of the company. And the value of the company is all your future cash flows and everything else. So there's a big gap between the value of a company and what the balance sheet says the value of the company is, right? And people have always asked, what is the delta? Well, where is that delta? Embedded in the delta of the real value is intangibles again. Intangibles are the relationships, intangibles are the brands, intangibles are the future customers and all that. And Ron, and I don't know if Ron, you're able to join us. I know you got your mask on right now, but Ron, about 20 years ago, maybe even longer than that, created a small practice trying to say we need to create intangible assets as a practice. So Ron, I'm going to call you in and just say, what were you thinking to complement what Mohab just now said about the value of intangible assets, where he's going very systematically, which I like, there's a rigor in there, versus at the high level conceptually.
So very good presentation, Mohab. It resonates very clearly, as Tender said, with a practice we were building and that we still do as a method, but it's not as explicit as yours. We call them, and I think it would be useful to have a work session offline about this. We call them intangible assets. We talk about competencies, assets, and technologies. And that's primarily as a communication vehicle to say these are not just intellectual property assets. So as soon as you call them intellectual assets, you get the legal department heavily involved because they see money everywhere and they see out licensing as the only business model they're interested in to get some cash quickly for the company. And part of that was a result of what happened within Arthur D. Little, which is at the time the largest contract research organization in the world. They The legal department got a hold of it, and all they wanted to do was license. They said the way to high value for the company is to inventory all of our intellectual property assets and license them out. And that was the beginning of the end of R30 Little, frankly, because they didn't look at all the other assets. They didn't look at all the business models for not just monetizing, but Hitendra's word, leveraging them in partnerships, leveraging them with our clients and customers. And so my appeal would be to agree on what we call these things jointly so we don't get people confused. And I like intangible assets, but we can do whatever we want to. And I think the other thing is it's an extremely useful systematic tool to use to assess a company's strengths and weaknesses. So we have a whole, we call CAT matrix. Are you strong, weak, dominant, whatever in these areas? Are they emerging or mature in terms of the applications you're looking at? It's a very rich set of methods that are out there that we can put together into this package. And it becomes useful not only for identifying opportunities and not only for monetizing current assets, but for understanding what assets we need to bundle together with our own assets and where we need to go for those. Do we need to partner with them or develop them ourselves? Are they emerging or mature or whatever? So is it make, collaborate, buy? We call it a make, collaborate, buy matrix for acquiring and leveraging these assets. So it's a good way of evaluating opportunities to see if you have what it takes to win and which additional assets you need to find out there in the marketplace or develop yourself to be able to win. So it's an incredibly rich area. I applaud you for making it into a separate practice, but I would like to get together with you and talk about how we have some language that makes it very explicitly fit with some of these things that were pioneered at R30 Little 25 years ago or whatever. So I think it's a rich area, but we have to be careful not to let the legal department wants to take credit, and everybody wants to take credit. So that's fair. But the legal department wants to control it because they're lawyers. And so if you let that happen, whether it's at a university, I'd say the demise of many or most university partnerships have been battles over intellectual property, not over intangible assets, but over intellectual property, because the lawyers get involved. They're very competitive as they want to be. And so they want to prove that they can get some quick cash for the university or for the organization. So I think I, again, applaud your efforts. I think there's a lot to be done with this. I think it should be a mainstay of what everybody does in their innovation efforts, whether it's to evaluate opportunities, identify opportunities, or identify ways to monetize, I still like the word leverage, our assets better in existing partnerships, new partnerships, how to build our own ecosystem using those intangible assets. So great presentation. I couldn't agree more. It brings back kind of memories of what we've been trying to do in the past, but I think democratizing this and making it something that everybody can use and see the value of immediately, as well as long-term, as well as in growth opportunities, as well as monetary opportunities. So great job.
Thank you, Ron. Mohab, I wanted to share with you different examples that we think we might be right. And you tell us whether this is also part of the intangible assets. I'm going to invite Enrique to talk about what he's doing, and Irila. And I'm going to set up the stage, Enrique. I'm going to put you on spot over here. We got all the leaders of the of GIMI of different countries in South America to write a letter to the IDB. And the letter to the IDB is basically saying, hey, we need to work together. Now, these are 5 or 8 different CTPs who are not really connected to each other. And yet together, the letter they're writing is to the IDB saying we are one force. So Enrique, just want to share a little bit more about the IDB objectives and how those intangible assets, if we did not inventory them, how we would not be using them.
Yep. Well, first of all, You know, the idea is to bring together, you know, the Latin team. We have presence already from Mexico all the way to Peru, Brazil, Guatemala, you know, El Salvador, Ecuador. So the idea is how we can really approach to the IDB and introduce what we do, who we are, you know, as a team, and how we can help, you know, our countries in terms of how we can use their assets that they invest in each country, you know, to take the best out of this investment, you know. The letter is out already. I have connected with people directly from Colombia, with Innovation Lab, and with at least 10, I would say, like an officer from IDB that I've been talking through all these years. And they have put me on the right direction. They gave me already 4 names that, Enrique, you have to talk to these people. So now the idea is how we can really approach to them, because sometimes, depending on the country, the asset that they have, they invest in some particular projects. And for example, just a month ago, we actually trained, you know, 10 officers from Innovety, the investment arm in Peru that received the fund from the IDB to invest in innovation projects in our country. And they were really excited about that. They are bringing more people from the government, including the presidency of the Council of Ministers, which is great because they are developing the digital strategy for Peru as a country for digital transformation. So good things, I believe.
Enrique,
You know,
the question I'm asking is to Mohab. Is that an example of GIMI somehow inventorying its intangible assets, which are each individual country is just a dot, put the dots together and connect them in a way that makes it feel cohesive as a force that could do continental change. And so the proposal this guy's put together was, hey, we are the one-stop shop for economic development of SMEs and innovation. And we collectively should be the one face to you to work with us. And those assets were always there. We had them. We just didn't, we came to the conclusion like about 4 weeks ago or 6 weeks ago that, hey, why don't we come together? But if we inventoried it according to your methodology, go ahead, and then we had spent the time during a brainstorm session of how do we use these dots, we might have come up with the answers much earlier versus almost by luck backing into this.
And actually, you know, I believe I agree with you, HP, and also with the definition of Mohab. And you know what? Also, I would like to add the CAF, the CAF, that also is investing, not only the IDB, but CAF, that I already spoke with them and they told me, Enrique, that's great, sounds good. So I want to talk to Laura just to write a similar letter, but in this case, directed to the CAF, because they also are investing in this type of projects in Latin American region. And I believe, as you mentioned, as a group, as a team, we can create an intangible asset that, hey, we can transform an entire, you know, well, in this case, region, you know.
I just want to give you case studies and then you argue, Mohab. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah.
Is this part of it? Does it make sense? Or
Absolutely. I mean, absolutely. This is definitely an intangible asset that you just described now, HP. Anything that has to do with kind of relations, channels, ways that you can, and as Ron mentioned, he's absolutely correct that how can you take 2 assets and take them together and, you know, come up with an opportunity from them. That's another way of doing it. So absolutely, this is an asset. You gave the example of the GIMI network. It is definitely a very clear asset. It's an intangible. We call of a soft IP or an intangible asset that you can do many things with it, for sure. And you are right about the fact that if organizations follow through this process of doing this intellectual asset table and being meticulous about looking at all the different things that they have in a very structured way, probably they would be able to reach many different opportunities a lot faster than doing it in an ad hoc way, just thinking about it and brainstorming about it. So that's personally what I like about this methodology, that it's pretty structured and it's a step-by-step process.
Thank you, Enrique, for providing the case study on this thing. If you have questions, guys, please put your hand up to.
I think, yeah, I would like to add, but as well to understand a little bit more also from Mohab perspective in terms of definition. When we are talking about communities and networks like HP, go to the example, right? And we have seen several communities and networks out there, but I would say it does make any difference the fact that when you capture the value from the network and community, such as the example that we got, like how we are becoming together, to go to funder, which is at regional level, and go as a team, right? And think what can we do at a systemic level, right? In order to accelerate SMEs in the whole region. And might be several examples what we are trying to do here as GIMI, like have a common language around the world and all these things. So capture value. But there are other networks and communities that I've seen that maybe we don't capture value as an organization or as a company. So how do we defer this, right? In terms of when we measure these intangible assets that we say, is this part of the definition, right? That we have to capture the value, or is it just, it's a checkbox? You have a network, you have a community, and that's it, right? Just to understand, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. So let's take the example of GIMI, for example. We know that GIMI owns a lot of its own assets, things related to copyright, things like software, things like these are assets that actually GIMI owns. And these are what we call structural assets. And then anything that has to do with the outside world, such as the networks, the channels, the kind of champions that you might have, the training service providers that are from all over the world. These are all called a relational type of capital. Here, what you do, Irila, is that you document and you state each one of the assets that you think would make sense and the ones that you presently have. And then you basically ask yourself, is this something that you are able to control, you're able to protect, or is this just an intangible asset? If it's an intangible asset that you cannot protect, then in that case, you're just going to ask yourself, okay, how can I leverage this intangible asset in a way that would bring value to me as an organization? And you can do that by saying, well, I'm going to bring those intangible assets together. I'm going to be partnering with this organization, and this is the direction that I want to proceed with. You can do something like this. Or maybe you can start saying, okay, these are the intangible assets that I have. Maybe if I document them in a way, I can bring them from an intangible asset to a tangible asset that I can later on protect, and therefore I can later on capitalize or leverage and to couple a business model to it. So I hope this is clear to you how we do this.
Mohab, if I can add a comment to that, it's also equally important on intangible assets because the return on asset is harder now. The return is a quantifiable number, and the second you put pressure on an asset for returns, that asset can get killed. So I also want to emphasize that there is this very soft, does it make sense? Does it help us? Will this be helpful for us in the future? Kind of discussion also called optionality. Does the asset create optionality for us? Not necessarily specific value now. So the way to protect intangible assets also is to make sure that you don't overanalyze the value outcome out of it, but to kind of say, does it make sense to keep it going? And it's hard because the number crunches will kill it very quickly. They'll say this is not very valuable. So let's make sure as we talk about intangible, there's a reason why they are intangible. People as much smarter than us allowed those intangible assets to survive in companies because they knew there was a value in it. And they couldn't verbalize it or articulate it. So they kind of didn't put it on the balance sheet. What we are suggesting is put it on a official innovation balance sheet. Let's create an innovation balance sheet and put those things in there and manage them in a different way, right? So that's the first part. I wanted to move to I see Ron's hand is up because I always value when Ron puts his hands up to say something. Ron, if I can I'm going to diverge a little bit and come back to you if you don't mind. I wanted to just share with you, when I was at Motorola, we created the first electric car. It was a beautiful Corvette in 1992. And that car, after it was built and everything else, we put in the garage and it disappeared. We also did the same thing with a whole bunch of other really cool stuff, whether it was flat panel displays, whether it was GPS, and we did all those things. And what we were not good at, and this is Mohab, the message, I think part of the intangible, is we created things again and again of amazing stuff. But then when it didn't work on the market on that day, we buried it. We forgot about it. And to bring them out and inventory saying, can we talk about what we did 3 years ago and what did we learn from that, is also part of the intangible asset, the knowledge, the past knowledge, and the IP that's created, but it's deliberately forgotten because it was a loser. But it's not a loser. It was a knowledge creating exercise at the end, right? And so how do you make sure the cultural part of the organization doesn't see those as failures, and therefore we don't talk about it and bring them out again. So just want to make sure, even on the product side, not just relational, there is a lot of knowledge being accumulated over there. Mohab, and then we'll give it Ron, because Ron's got his hand up on this, how to manage intangible assets.
No, I mean, I have nothing to add, HP. I mean, you're absolutely correct. I mean, the part that has to do with the kind of accumulated knowledge and the accumulated know-how that organizations would have is actually one of the very important things that we do measure, and this is why we have something called, aside from the structure and the relationship, we look at the human capital side, and the human capital side looks at this kind of accumulated knowledge, the kind of internal expertise, what are the skills that perhaps the people inside the organization would have that others might not have. What are the kind of differentiating points again in even how you do business itself. This sometimes companies or organizations, they don't realize that this is something valuable that they need to capitalize on or try to make better of. They just use it as part of their day-to-day operations. So we try to look at these things again from the human capital side of things. Ron, please go ahead.
So great discussion. I think that at least in our experience, there's not a battle, but it's important to measure and build and leverage these assets, both short and longer term. And usually the only people in an organization who have that time frame are those who are responsible for innovation and those who are responsible for strategy, and maybe the board or the CEO. But it's important to keep that management responsibility and control for intangible assets with these broad organizations that have both short and long-term missions, and to therefore also be able to build metrics to measure the organization's process in building these assets, not just leveraging. It's important that companies, while they're doing day-to-day things, are building assets that provide competitive advantage and differentiation and value to the corporation. And when that value is recognized, then have people in the organizations or teams in the organization or partners of the organization find ways to leverage them better. And I think it's really, really critical that the responsibility reside with teams or people who have both long and short-term missions and who get measured for their performance. So companies like DuPont, et cetera, were famous for having separate tracks of people in R&D, and those people were measured on how they built competitive advantage and value in intangible assets. And I think that that's really important, because otherwise everything gravitates to how can I make money from these today, as opposed to how I can build competitive advantage today and tomorrow. So I think it's a powerful, powerful tool, but we have to make sure that the management of it and the control of it doesn't devolve to some green, we usually call them green eye shade accountants, no offense to any accountants on the call, but who are just looking for short-term cash returns. And that's certainly part of it, but it's not anywhere near the whole picture as you've outlined.
One of the things that we do around here is that when we do this exercise and the whole process, we actually come up with many different type of opportunities that are leveraging on these different intellectual assets, and then we basically prioritize them according to impact and feasibility. And one of the things, so we actually look into which ones do we think can be considered as quick wins for the organization, things that they can do very, very quickly, and other ones, as you pointed out, things that can be more of strategic value and more on the longer term. So there is a last phase that we do, I didn't mention it here, where we do this type of prioritization to the different opportunities.
So just as a case in point, we finally got two different cosmetics companies to recognize that digital facial mapping was a competency that they needed to build, a technology they needed to have access to that was going to provide both short-term buzz and long-term competitive advantage. And neither of them had the capability, but there were a bunch of potential partners and startups who did have that capability. And there was kind of a winner take, who are you reaching out now for an emerging technology or competency that's going to make a huge difference in facial cosmetics, facial treatments,
Right.
is a big deal. But you don't have anybody in the organization who feels that they're measured on that. So there's no individual person in marketing or R&D or any place else. There's no organization. Everybody has a piece of this. And that's what makes it difficult, but it's also what makes it incredibly important and valuable to the company to do this. So
if I can add to what Ron says, Mohab, in your methodology, maybe you have it. I think one is inventorying what you have, but there's another one is recognizing what the future looks like and what the gaps are. And so there are future competencies or assets needed, and what's the plan for acquisition of those competencies to be successful in the future. I don't know if you have the gap in there of holes.
yeah, but
If I can just answer that question, Ron, and because HP, because this can also be useful to the ones with us on this call. Once we go into the business opportunity mapping, we do look at the different trends. So we have in our left hand, we have the existing intellectual assets, but we also see the ways that we can leverage them. We do look definitely into the different trends that we can capitalize on. So yes.
So Mohab, just one other point on this. The tool we have that's actually not, we didn't invent it, we've invented it while we were at Arthur D. Little, is this make, collaborate, buy matrix. And so you're both assessing, first of all, what potential impact does this competency, asset, or technology have? And
Right.
you classify it as base, key, pacing, or emerging on the vertical axis. And then the horizontal axis, it's what's our current competitive position in this individual cat. And then you can say, all right, can we get by with just a threshold, passable competitive advantage, or do we want to use it as a leadership advantage? And so it's a great visual tool and gamification tool to talk about how we're positioned, how we could be positioned, and how we could enable our company to win both in its current markets and in emerging markets. So as Satendra said, kind of combining the past, present, future status with the individual cat is a really key visual tool that seems to be very powerful with decision makers, whether it's the board of directors or the senior management team, or even the people who are running innovation and strategy. But it's a very clever visual tool that was developed by Arthur D. Little long ago, primarily, as you might expect for Arthur D. Little. They were just looking at technologies.
So let me suggest something.
Expand it to cats.
Yeah. So Ron, I'm sorry I'm interrupting. I apologize for that.
Oh, good.
We are at 11 o'clock and we need to try and wrap this thing, bring it to end for the people who are watching this on Facebook or LinkedIn and other channels. Mohab, I'm going to say a few things and I'll give you the last 30 seconds, 1 minute to wrap this thing up. One of the intangible assets that I remember at Motorola that was utilized really well was it was in our values, and the values was respect your senior engineers. And we would ask, what the hell do we need old senior engineers for? Because they were always a little out of date on technology, the latest tools, because the world was changing very fast. But all these older guys had some wisdom. They had pattern recognition of all the past projects and all the knowledge that came out of it. And therefore, having one of those guys on your team was going to give you a lot more speed in terms of mistakes that were made in the past that you wouldn't make anymore. And so Motorola actually converted the value of that intangible asset by saying we respect our seniors. By putting we respect our seniors as part of our values, it protected that intangible asset. So again, there's mechanisms that have to be put in place to make sure those intangible assets stay protected or not forgotten, discarded, and disappear. Because yes, the world changes and the new thing always looks better and shinier. And we want to forget the rest. So I'm going to leave that one other example of an intangible asset of senior people, very valuable people for us. And then Mohab, you have the last word.
Well, I would just say that, you know, whether your client is a corporate, for-profit, non-for-profit, university, NGO, all these different type of organizations have stuff that they own and might not be aware of, and this is where you definitely a methodology like this or other methodologies like doing assessments of intellectual assets are very, very valuable. I've personally seen that this is an eye-opener to many organizations. They don't realize what they have. And I think if this can be very useful for you to, you know, to grow as someone who wants to run with GIMI. And I think it's another nice way to leverage what GIMI has into an application and in a direction that would make a lot of sense to many organizations.
That's great, Mohab. Mohab Anas from Innovety in Egypt, in Cairo. He's the managing director of that organization and the leader of innovation probably in the country. Written many books on the topic of innovation and teachers in the university. We are privileged and honored to have Mohab as part of our GIMI network. And he's been a good friend and a good colleague for the many, many years. Thank you, Mohab, for being on our GIMI think tank. Thank you, everybody. We'll return next week with, again, a topic on either innovation trends, innovation management, or innovation going on in another country. Today, we learned about innovation management 4.0 of intangible assets. Thank you, Mohab. Thank you, everybody, for listening and participating. Bye-bye.